Hello, uh, that's the English language version of Conversations for Hungary. And I would like to deal today in today's broadcast with the celebration of March 15th, the Hungarian uprising against the Habsburgs in 1848. So I would like to discuss the speech of the Prime Minister and then put it in a larger context. Hungarians are prone to basically explain national holidays according to their political views. And March 15th is not an exception. Everybody interprets it differently. And the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, gave a speech, as tradition, in front of the National Museum. And in that speech, I think you know that he heavily emphasized the notion of freedom. Hungarian freedom has been always the desire and the dream of Hungarians, and we all know that Hungarian history has been fairly bloody, and in addition, Hungary hasn't been a totally free and sovereign country basically since 1301, and then 1918, which was the truncated Hungary, and then from 45 to 48, but then after that, obviously, you know, there was the Soviet occupation. So basically Hungary became free in 1990, and when the Soviet Red Army moved out of Hungary, elections were held and so on and so forth. The current situation is different because the current government has been in office since 2010. Since 2010, they were re-elected twice, in 2014 and recently 2018, and mostly with a two-thirds majority in the parliament, but not the votes. Only in 2010 did Fidesz, the ruling party, receive 42% of the popular votes. In 2014 it was below 50, and in 2018 it was even more below 50%. But still, because of the shenanigans of the electoral law, Fidesz was able to maintain a two-thirds majority. Unfortunately, and we know that from Hungarian history, the opposition is fragmented and hasn't played a role in the political life of Hungary. I personally wrote extensively on the Hungarian situation. I was critical of the first Orbán government between 1998 and 2002. I was even more critical of his role and his party's role in opposition from 2002 to 2010. In particular, what happened after the elections that they lost in 2006, that basically they incited mobs and stormed a variety of government buildings, mainly that was at that time the old headquarters of the Hungarian television. So I'm on record basically with my anti-Orbán and anti-government critics. I must also say that in the last half of 2017, I published an open letter first to the Prime Minister and then to the Hungarians. I also wrote extensively about Orbán's dictatorial traits. My piece was called The Hungarian Chavez, which speaks for itself. And then I basically spoke against the corruption, calling it a gangster regime. Also submitted a petition under the Global Magnitsky Act against Mr. Orbán, his members of his family, and his close associates, to both the secretaries of Treasury and the Secretary of State, and that is under scrutiny and investigation now by both departments. That leads me to the celebration of March 15th, which we all know that what happened in 1848, that a group of young Hungarians who were imbued with the ideas of the French Revolution decided to publish a 12-point petition, petitioning basically the Habsburg government in Vienna to provide all kinds of freedoms to Hungarians, including Hungarian National Bank, which is independent of the National Bank of the Empire, also press freedom and other things, including the release of political prisoners. I must say that, you know, there was only one political prisoner at that time incarcerated in Pest, and we know that it was Mihály Táncsics, who was pretty soon dropped by the young revolutionaries. I think Táncsics was the first Hungarian communist advocating the freedom for the peasants, and also for the very small working class at that time in Hungary, which did not fit into the pattern of what the revolutionaries wanted to accomplish. We also know what happened. Basically, the Hungarian uprising was defeated by the joint forces of Austria and the Russian Empire, Miklos I. We know about the 13 martyrs who were executed in Arad, and so on and so forth. So with that historical background, Mr. Orbán, the Prime Minister, gave a speech in Hungarian, which in my opinion is a disgrace and full of historical distortions, lies, and basically idiotic remarks. Okay, the gist of Orbán's speech can be reduced to 2 points. The one that basically Hungarians have valued freedom throughout their history, and finally, you know, under him and the reign of his government, that freedom has been accomplished. The second theme was basically that freedom can only be maintained and developed if Hungary does not accept the trend in the European Union, namely toward more centralization, but that Hungary should resist in the name of national and individual freedom, and he would like to set up his own faction within the European Parliament in Brussels. He invited the Polish Prime Minister, who came. The most distinct difference between what the Polish Prime Minister said and Orbán said is very simple. The Polish Prime Minister did not advocate splitting from the so-called People's Party's bloc and establish a Central East European bloc separate from the conservative bloc within the European Parliament. And what he said, Poland, Hungary, and Europe, which means, that he made clear that he does not want to split from the conservative bloc within the European Parliament. So there is the first disagreement, and even if we assume, let's assume it that Orbán would be able to talk to the Poles, talk to the Italians, talk to the Austrians, and some other countries regarding the formation of a new bloc. I still think, that the Poles definitely will not split from the conservative bloc and the European Union. The Italians definitely not. The Austrians. So that's a pipe dream that Mr. Orbán is following or pursuing, and of course, he would like to be the leader of that new faction, that new formation. So if we look at his notion of freedom that he praises ad nauseam, okay, we must compare it with his previous speeches, in which he termed Hungary as an illiberal democracy. Of course, etymologically, we know that liberal comes from the Latin liberatus, which means, freedom, individual freedom, nobility, good morality, and so on and so forth, which was basically in the Middle Ages used more in terms of liberal arts and that kind of stuff, until two Scotsman, William Robertson, who was a historian, and in 1697 published a book in which he basically politicized the word liberalism and made it a household name in sense of a political orientation, which is absolutely free of prejudices, historical traditions, and so on and so forth, and points toward the future. On Robertson's book came the Wealth of the Nations, which Adam Smith's contribution to liberalism. He basically extended the term of political liberalism to economic liberalism, and that's what we have now under the terms of capitalism. Then we can go on and talk about the establishment of the Liberal Party in 1820 as opposed to the Whig Party, and so on and so forth. So basically, liberalism means freedom, that Mr. Orbán, in his speech, praised as a Hungarian unicum, so to speak, in terms of national trait. But how would that kind of liberalism gel with his statements regarding that Hungary does not have a liberal democracy. Hungary has an illiberal democracy. Clearly, when you say something is ill, it means that exactly the opposite of what democracy, what liberalism means. So basically, he advocates an unfree democracy. That clearly, logically, either you have a democracy or you don't have a democracy. Either you have freedom or you don't have freedom. So clearly, that's the first anomaly that Mr. Orban created for himself. But that how should I say, unbridgeable problem does not disturb Mr. Orban, and went on to claim that Hungarians as a nation, as an ethnicity, always yearned together for freedom and sovereignty for the Hungarian nation. That he coupled, of course, with Christianity, which is neatly tied to anti-immigration, anti-migrant policies, claiming that letting in Muslim refugees will basically dilute Hungary's Christian, the Hungarian nation's Christian roots and Christian essence, and that obviously, if you give up Christianity, you give up freedom. He came to that conclusion very simple by saying that Christianity invented freedom, which again shows that Mr. Orban is not very not a good student of history, because first of all, Christianity grew out of Judaism. And the Old Testament, and particularly the second part of the Old Testament, the first is obviously the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then you have the prophets, what in Hebrew they call Naviim, okay? And throughout the Old Testament, in the 5 books of Moses and the books of prophets, basically the Jews, every Jew individually, always argues with the Lord, with God, which obviously in Hebrew has different names, but a part of that. So it is not that Judaism was slavishly following the commands of God. Jews always argued with the Lord and questioned every single step of his. The joke nowadays goes in Tel Aviv that 3 rabbis are sitting at the same table. That's a Jewish joke because it never happened that 3 rabbis agreed with each other to the point that they sat down together at the same table. So to start, and Jesus was basically one of those Jews who questioned not just the Lord, but also questioned the tenets of the holy books. So just to illustrate the point, even the 14th bishop of Jerusalem, who was appointed by the Pope in Rome, was a Jew. He was not a Christian, he was a Jew. So talking about Christianity, the root of freedom is Christianity, is clearly wrong. I mean, that cannot be sustained. But going on and dissecting his speech, he claims that Hungarians throughout the year between the two March 15th periods are praying. Hungarians in unison are praying to the God or the Lord of the Hungarians. Again, I mean, either there is one God for everybody, or the Hungarians have a separate God, which obviously he did not identify. And then, you know, the question arises that if the Hungarians have a separate God, then why the Americans, the Irish, the Polish, and so on and so forth do not have their own gods? And, you know, then we will be back to the Egyptian and the Greek and even Roman eras where we had multiple gods, the same with Hinduism and Buddhism and so on and so forth. Obviously, Judaism, the invention of Judaism was in the contribution of Judaism to mankind was the single God. And that is clearly followed by Christianity too. But going on and dissecting the speech, he said that Hungarians have the right, and he says right, to their own life, and that life should only be determined by the whims of the Hungarians. Again, clearly, the question arises, when was Hungary the sole superpower of the globe? If Hungary would be the only superpower, or Hungary would live in a vacuum, then, you know, it is understandable that Hungarians can live their lives the way they want, and they can do whatever they want and totally neglect their surroundings. We know that Hungarian history played out totally differently, namely Hungary in the geographical middle of Europe was invaded from the north, from the east, from the west, from the south, all over the place. And clearly, maybe the rest of the world did not understand that Hungarians are living in a vacuum and can do whatever they want to do with their lives. Particularly nowadays, I mean, Hungary is a member of both NATO and a member of the European Union, which both have, the one has 29, the other has 28 members. And Hungary, and I'm sorry to say that and tell Mr. Orbán, Hungary is not the largest, the wealthiest, and the most important country in either of those alliances. As a matter of fact, as far as the European Union is concerned, the three poorest regions within the entire European Union can be found in Hungary. A small country the size of Indiana, with a population which is shrinking and now way below 10 million, and no strategic importance. So to claim that the liberty or the freedom for Hungarian means that they can disregard their surroundings, their alliances, and everything else, and can live, life the way they want as a incorrigible teenager who doesn't listen to the words of his teachers or parents or so on and so forth is ridiculous, at least. Then he goes on and again, gets back to the Hungarian freedom, which he defines as absolutely unique in the world. And he says, if there is freedom in Hungary, Hungary has everything. Hungary has happiness, security, a lot of children, growing, wealthy country, and a strong nation. Now, first of all, Hungary doesn't have freedom, and the best proof for that is that the birth rate has declined in Hungary, and we know for decades. Hungarians are maybe one of the unhappiest people according to all the polls within the European Union. Hungary is not getting richer, wealthier. Hungary is getting poorer and poorer, and I will get back to the reasons for that. And Hungary is not a strong nation. So let's start with the strong nation notion. According to all the statistics, since 2010, when Fidesz, Orbán's party, took over the reins of government, at least 900,000 Hungarians left Hungary and sought their so-called Hungarian happiness outside Hungary. We know that, as I said, the birth rate declines. That has been going on for a long time. My father was a gynecologist, and I happen to know the story of abortion in Hungary. Actually, when I left Hungary and landed at the University of Regensburg and in the East European Institute, my first essay in the yearbook of the institute was a comparative study of the abortion laws throughout the so-called socialist countries. I had to write it because at that time in Germany they discussed Section 218, which forbade abortion, whether to lift it or not. So that is again something that Orbán got wrong. Next, whether Hungary is getting wealthier under the Orbán government, again I would refer to not just to my study, but to the writings of many foreigners. The last Sargentini report, which basically says that Orbán, his family, and his closest associates robbed the country blind. Hungary is still the largest recipient of Brussels' largesses. Hungary is getting much more money back from Brussels than Hungary pays in, which basically makes the Hungarian economy just above the water. So that the Hungarian economy is in the black is not because of the Hungarian economy. It is because of the money that they are getting from Brussels, which, as everybody knows, will be reduced in starting 2021. So the monies that the Orbán government collected from Brussels were embezzled, were spent on the Prime Minister's pet projects, namely building soccer stadiums. Okay. And I haven't seen any productive investment of that money or other monies in Hungary. What we saw, spectacular projects. I would like to name POKS 2, the addition that they would like to add 2 nuclear plants to reactors to the nuclear plant in Paks, which clearly everybody knows that those projects are designed to steal additional money and to increase corruption by Mr. Orban and his family and people closest to him. The Paks obviously brought Putin and Orban together. As we know, Putin has been the guest of the Hungarian government and Mr. Orban at least twice every year. Moscow announced that he will come to Hungary or go to Hungary in the second half of the year. Most probably Mr. Orban will also go to Moscow to see whether, you know, the Kremlin is still the same, or, you know, they improved the quality of the buildings there. So what we see now is totally different from what Mr. Orban has been trying to sell to the Hungarians. And here I must say, you know, that I don't blame Mr. Orban and the people around him alone. I blame also the Hungarian people, because, you know, they elected that person, and as I already illustrated, he was corrupt between 1998 and 2002. Everybody knew that he has that dictatorial proclivity. We know how he behaved between 2002 and 2010 in opposition, and in spite of that, 52% of the Hungarians elected him, which gave him two-thirds absolute majority in the Hungarian parliament. Accordingly, they changed the Hungarian constitution in a way that made them guilt-proof with respect to all the corruption, all the embezzlement, all the criminal activities that they carried out since, you know, they are in power. So if Hungarians are happy with Mr. Orban and his government and all the corruption, all the embezzlement, all the criminal activities that are going on, you know, that's their business. But only Hungarian voters can go and tell Mr. Orban and his people that we do not accept what you are doing in Hungary. We do not accept a gangster government, a gangster regime over us. He destroyed education, he destroyed the health care system, he destroyed the financial regime in Hungary, and he did not develop the economy. Actually, the economy is developing backwards. I mentioned the regions. I would like to say that with the exception of Bulgaria, Hungary is the poorest country within the European Union. And the fact that 900,000 Hungarians voted with their feet means that those 900,000 Hungarians do not trust the rest of the Hungarians that they will vote out that gangster regime of power. Going to the second topic, which is foreign affairs. Mr. Orban does not want a closer union, because that will also entail what Brussels created, namely a joint union prosecutorial office. They say that, you know, they don't agree, they don't want to let in the prosecutors of the European Union to investigate Hungarian corruption, how EU monies were spent in Hungary, and so on and so forth. Mr. Orbán installed in 1998 basically a pawn by the name of Peter Polt, whom he brought back in 2010, and Mr. Polt is basically nothing else but a pawn of Mr. Orbán. As Nikita Khrushchev, the then first secretary of the Communist Party, explained to President Kennedy, introducing Gromyko, his foreign minister, he says, if I will tell Gromyko to sit with his bare ass on the ice, he will do it without, questioning why I ordered him to do so. So that's pretty much the relationship between Mr. Orbán and the chief prosecutor in Hungary, Mr. Peter Polt. So that's number one. Viktor Orbán does not want the European Union to look into what's going on in Hungary. Number two, he does not want Hungary to be instructed in foreign and military policies by Brussels. He himself is weak to have any influence on the European Union's foreign and military policies, but he could be a destructive force, a Trojan horse, through Vladimir Putin and the monies that Vladimir Putin make available for Mr. Orbán and the people around him. Box 2 is absolutely unnecessary. Everybody knows that. Hungary does not have the money to pay for it, and the only reason that POX, the agreement was signed, by the way, which was kept top secret for many years. Nobody knew how it was negotiated. It is a terrible agreement. There's no other reason than to enrich Mr. Orbán and the people around him. So opening toward Russia means that Hungary and Mr. Orbán want to move again away from the West and get closer to the East. Now, Hungarians who know Hungarian history will understand that whenever Hungary abandoned its quest to join the West and become more westernized and gazed toward the East and emulated the East, Hungary always ended in a catastrophe. And so what is repeating itself, that Mr. Orbán is preparing himself for the after the 21 era when Brussels money will decrease, and he would like to get Russian money, and in addition to the Russian money, obviously the Chinese also showed up in Hungary. There is a fairly large Chinese colony now mostly in Budapest, and most of them are nothing else but places of money laundering for the Chinese, okay, and to a certain extent to the Hungarians too. So if we look in totality at both the domestic as well as the foreign policies of Mr. Orbán, both are total disaster. And I would like to close my remarks by saying Mr. Orbán is not the prime minister that Hungary needs now. Hungary needs a prime minister who is honest, who is pro-European, who is loyal to both alliances that Hungary is a member to, and does not corrupt the European Union with bringing in the Russians, Mr. Putin, and the Chinese. And as a matter of fact, for these reasons, Mr. Orban must be voted out. So both the opposition must unite, and the Hungarian people also must wise up to the fact that Hungary is not progressing, but Hungary is going down the drain. And that situation will continue as long as Mr. Orban and his party has absolute majority in the Hungarian parliament. Mr. Orban must be brought to account. He and his family and his closest associates must face justice. In Hungary, return the money that they stole from both the European Union and the Hungarian people. Unless Hungarians do that, Hungary will continue to remain the poorest or the second poorest country of the Union, and the three regions, which are again the poorest in the European Union, will continue to decline. This way, you cannot have the Hungarian people united and stand for freedom and stand for the values that Western Europe and the United States both espouse. You cannot be a member of the Western alliances and at the same time say that you do not accept the values of those alliances, those nations, and those people. Because if you do that, you will be kicked out. And if you are kicked out, then Hungary will suffer, and Hungary will disappear on the ash heap of history. Thank you for listening to me. Please send me your comments, and next week I will again speak to you about Hungary and about the European Union and the United States. Thank you so much for listening.